So welcome again to the second webinar in our Power of Social Innovation series. Today's webinar, Engaging the Citizen as Co-Producer of Social Good, is sponsored by the Ash Center's Government Innovators Network in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. Before I pass the floor over to today's moderator, Professor Julie Wilson, we have 3 poll questions that will help our speakers make their remarks as relevant as possible to today's audience. This is the first question. Which sector are you representing? You just click on the small circle to the left of your choice. We'll just wait another 5 seconds or so. As you can see, we've got a good mix. Okay, the next question. What type of work are you involved in? Okay, just a few more seconds. We'll go to the third, final poll for now. And this is just to get a sense of how many of us there are today. So please allow me to introduce Professor Julie Boatwright Wilson. Professor Wilson is a well-regarded expert here at the Kennedy School in disciplines ranging from poverty and family policy to urban race relations. Among Professor Wilson's recent projects are studies on the historical development of poor neighborhoods, on adoption, and on community-based strategies for strengthening families. Professor Wilson is not only familiar with today's topic from a scholarly perspective, though, having spent 3 years at the New York State Department of Social Services, where she directed the Office of Program Planning, Analysis, and Development. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to introduce Maurice Miller and Judith Kurland. Maurice, founder of the Family Independence Initiative, has devoted his career to working with low-income and immigrant communities. He spent 22 years as Executive Director of Asian Neighborhood Design, which is a multi-service community development agency that has offices in San Francisco and Oakland. This FII, for the Asian Neighborhood Design, is known for and has been recognized for its excellence. But it was his experience building this agency and watching what happened to the families it served and the children of those families that convinced him to radically change his approach to supporting low-income and immigrant families. Judith Kurland is Chief of Programs and Partnerships for Boston's Mayor Tom Menino. She has had a long career in healthcare provision at the city and federal levels, including a stint as Regional Director of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Resources. Judith's career is perhaps best described as one of building multi-sectoral, multi-state and city, public-private coalitions and partnerships on issues that range from energy, housing, health programs, and all sorts of other policies. You'll find more information on both panelists on the website. Now, we have an hour, but we'd like to start by focusing our discussion on Maurice's experience as an innovator in social policy and how Boston, which has become a big supporter of FII, the Family Independence Initiative, plans to move forward to try to implement it. In addition, Judith pointed out that not all innovations are effective, and we're hoping our discussion will provide some guidance as to why some innovations work effectively but others don't. So Maurice, let's start with you.
Thank you, Julie. It's really nice to be with everybody. I'm going to bring out the slides that I'm going to be presenting. I think some of the background was that I'd run a large social service agency for about 20 years. And in that process, which was, it goes back into the late 70s, I did get concerned as to whether we were really impacting poverty. The project that you're looking at, the Family Independence Initiative, really got started from a conversation with then Mayor Jerry Brown. At that point, Jerry Brown, who's now running for governor of California, was the mayor. He called me up at dinner time at my house complaining that after 30 years of the war on poverty, nonprofits like mine and other things that I was involved in had an impact on poverty. I blamed it on not having enough money, too much government regulation. He blamed it on us not coming up with solutions. And what was interesting, he stopped the conversation and then said, okay, so if you could do anything you wanted to do and you wanted to really make a difference in breaking the cycle of poverty, what would you do? And come into my office next month and tell me. And so this was, the conversation was really the start of the Family Independence Initiative. I was already working at my agency at that particular point in time, and Jerry Brown's challenge really was fascinating. So if you could really do anything you wanted to do, what would you do? And I thought for about a week and a half, given my personal experience coming from a single mom family with no money, to the 20 years I'd had of experience in the nonprofit sector, and after a week and a half came to the conclusion that I didn't know what I would do to really make a difference. But my mother was Mexican, single mom, 2 kids. My sister really had a lot of trouble with my mom working 2 jobs. And however, my mother decided that, she had to at least get 1 kid out of poverty, and so she focused the rest of her life, which wasn't real long, on getting me out, and I ended up in UC Berkeley as an engineer. And it's true, my life was radically changed, with the purpose being that then I come back and help the family and other families. So when I went back to Jerry, I had a meeting at his office, and he asked me, okay, so what would you do to really have an impact? And I said, well, I don't know what I would do, but I know what my mother did, and I think that every mother would know what they would want to do, and that fathers, per se, also would know what they would want to do. And so instead of hiring a bunch of professionals, what I suggested to him is, okay, let's set some of the money aside and let's pay the families that they would show us what they would do to get their families out of poverty. And I have a really pretty in-depth database that had been developed while I was with my agency. Jerry Brown thought that was kind of fascinating, and so he helped set up and start the Family Independence Initiative with a commission that included the congresswoman and the head of state social services, et cetera. And we were all curious what the families would do. So FII was really initially started to really be a social laboratory, to really test what the capacity was of families to really move ahead pretty much on their own. But at the time that Jerry Brown called me, I was already questioning whether social services really could be the impact. I knew we were helping people, but I was studying how people in this country had gotten out of poverty in a more natural way before there were all these programs. And this country has a huge history, whether most of it was immigrant, but it wasn't just immigrant. After slavery, African Americans built Tulsa and townships all over, districts in Harlem, every place, and I went back and studied those. I saw how Native American tribes in Alaska had developed huge corporations, and how Cambodian refugees in more recent history had come to own 80 or 90% of the donut shops in California. And there were 2 elements that were really key to that. One was that somebody, in what we call in our terminology, kind of the positive deviant, somebody took an initiative to do something, whether it was get a job at a meat factory, which Polish did, or to start the donut shop. So there were these positive deviants that, however, were people that then would share that knowledge and share capital and help other things happen. So we were able to track the Cambodian experience, where it got back to 1 family, then helped 2 other families, et cetera, and that then became a process that people got into donut shops. And what I came to realize is that I was running social services and programs that really relied on my workers, my case managers, my social workers, employment specialists, and that in many ways we ran counter to really allowing for the mutuality and the individual initiative. So basically, I was really questioning whether the current models could impact it, and FI was really set up to do that. So to give you a little bit of background then, I'm not sure if in these slides, if the boxes that you see are kind of the bell curve of the population in this country, and we're primarily concerned with the boxes, the blue boxes on the left. And this country does have set up systems to help people. One of the systems, and there's a study by the Corporation for Enterprise Development, looks at all the benefits available from this country, and if you make $80,000 and more, you can actually get pretty significant benefits from the government that can help you, almost all based on the initiative you take. If you buy one house, you get a certain set of benefits. You buy two houses, you get more. The other set of benefits really are around welfare and whatever, and those are set up actually in the opposite way. The more trouble you get, the more that you actually end up involved in getting resources. And that, excuse me, I need to move a little bit. And so one of the dilemmas that we were really interested in is that most of my efforts in leading my social service agency at that time really were focused on people at poverty level and below. And that my mother, however, was somebody who had come from being in poverty, had tried to move and actually became more of a regular worker and in clerical work and whatever, and got above the poverty level, and then found out that there was very little, if anything, that she was able to really get help from. And so what we became interested in is, okay, how would all this happen? So, hold on one second. And so, okay, so in this next slide, really what ends up happening is that there had been a study done that was released in 2008, and in that study done by the Census Bureau, it indicated that in a 3-year study, 3-year span, 97% of the folks that had been under the poverty level moved above the poverty level, which was a huge percentage that actually were able to struggle and make it above the poverty level. But again, what they found is that within 3 years, 30% of those people fell back into crisis and under the poverty level. And so what we were doing is really have this cycle, and this was exactly the cycle I saw in my agency, where I saw some of the kids that I had first trained and got jobs for, now I was seeing their kids come back into and fall back into crisis, and that's what happened in my family, where a third of my family, my sister, really fell into crisis. And so FI was really interested in understanding what happens in that population. It began and enrolled people that were near the poverty level, but by this time I'd been studying Grameen Bank and some of the social networks piece that goes back to that first model I told you about, that there'd been a natural process. So we started enrolling families, but only in groups of families that were friends already. We wanted to understand what social networks were, and we understood all the data was showing that social networks were really breaking down, but we wanted to see to what extent they existed. And in that set of social networks in San Francisco, the median income is about $26,000 for a family of 4, which means half of the families are below $26,000 a year and half are above. And this is how the social networks really manifested themselves. And so we have a lot of people that really were below the poverty level, but new people above, et cetera, et cetera. But we also knew that policies then, when they got above the poverty level, especially when they got above 130% of poverty, that there was really almost no help for the families to keep their families intact. And again, we were getting that 30% coming back down. What we came to the conclusion was that on the one hand, the safety net was really important. When my sister was taken away from my mother and by kind of an abusive husband, that when she ran away, she needed a shelter to run to. It needed to be free because she had no money. And so that the safety net really is supposed to be a safety net for people in crisis. But once you stabilize, once my mother had stabilized, then we need another system that helps them based on their initiative. And that's what we do for people that are middle and upper income. And what our effort is really to try to look at top-down policies that really integrate the type of incentives that are given to the middle and upper income, and try to bring our population, give them a chance to jump into a different set of benefits and different structure, not the welfare system per se, because that's really made for people in crisis. So we're looking at top-down policies, but we also know that in the natural efforts that were done, historically, that it took a lot of initiative from people themselves, and that they had to lead the effort, they had to actually help one another, and that was a central piece. It wasn't the outside help, but they needed to have access to the outside help, but the initiative had to come from the families themselves. I'm not going to go into the structure a whole lot. We can talk about that later because I think what we want to talk is about the obstacles to the kind of effort we're doing. We would bring people together in groups. There had to be 5 or 6 families all together. They are each given a computer. They have to go online every month and report to us what progress they've made because it's a learning piece. We'll pay them about $30, $25 to $30 to give us the information. It's spread out there's about 260 data points, but everything doesn't change in their lives. And so it takes about 15 to 20 minutes for them to report online. And the whole effort is really not to incent them to do certain particular things, but to really pay them enough to pay attention that they report it to us, and that's why the $30 figure. There's other things that they can get fellowships, that they take leadership, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that happened when we first started the project in Oakland was that we weren't working with immigrant families at all. At that point, we were working with refugees and African American communities. And one of the Salvadoran refugee families who did not stand out in any way in their group, however, got into this thing with some friends of trying to buy a house in a pretty tough neighborhood. They ended up working with a predatory lender. Our staff was over there. Well, we think they're getting taken by this predatory lender. Can we say something? And we told our staff this is a research project to try to figure out what the capacity was of families to do it themselves. And so, our staff was forbidden, and they'll be fired if they give any direction. And so the family went and they got the house, and sure enough, they were going to have to pay 65% of their income on mortgage payments. And they're going to lose the house. And the next thing that happened was pretty amazing for us. All these people that they borrowed money from to buy the house initially, descended on the house, repainted it, retiled it, re-landscaped it, and 6 months later they asked me to sit in on a refinance of the house, and sure enough, they were able to keep it. Within 2 months of that family keeping their house, every Salvadoran refugee family that had been sending all their money back to El Salvador as remittances started saving money, and within a year and a half, they all bought homes. Not only that, it was having a ripple effect. We were seeing African Americans buying homes. We were seeing friends of the refugee families buying homes and whatever. So we realized that not only did families follow one another within the groupings we had, but there had been a broader community ripple effect. So in San Francisco, we set up to really test the ripple effect, and we offered to the 16 core families that we started with for them to nominate families to bring into FII that they thought could benefit from FII. But if you nominated somebody, you had to orient them. I didn't want to hire more staff. You had to show them how to use the computer and report. And what we found is that within 6 months of opening up nominations, out of that 16 families, we got 200 families calling, wanting to join, all sponsored by somebody else. And so it had this ripple effect that was huge, and it really is much more how you saw entire communities of Irish, entire communities of other townships and whatever. So we saw the same thing happening in communities where before this hadn't been happening. And this really lends itself to scaling this whole effort. In terms of outcomes, we've had consistent outcomes in Oakland, San Francisco. We tried it in Hawaii. Household income has jumped because more people have gone to work. They've gotten raises. They've changed jobs to better careers. Again, in Oakland, if you look on the right-hand side, I think the original average income for a household was about $25,000. There was an increase of 27% within 2 years. In Hawaii, it was about 18%, and in San Francisco, it was about 21%. So, but it's not just the income. Actually, this whole thing is you saw families taking control of their lives. And for us, actually, what self-sufficiency is when families really, I'll skip over that, the policy implications, we can talk about that later. But for us, self-sufficiency is really that families gain control over their lives. They're the ones that are plotting out what they want to do. They take responsibility for it, and then they start developing and are given access to the choices. And again, it's this whole thing of having control over your life. And we have a ton of behavioral studies that say that giving up control, Google does it for their employees. 20% of the employees' time, even they have the infrastructure that Google has, but for 20% of the time, Google employees have total autonomy as to what they do. And so the best ideas have come out of that 20% time. What we did is with the families, we gave them total autonomy. They had access to a few of the resources, certainly not as much as Google can provide, but they had access to some of the resources because they could earn it. And sure enough, what we saw is they had much better outcomes than when I ran my agency. So I'm going to stop there in terms of the presentation. but you can tell that this type of effort that shifts the responsibility and resources for change to the families actually runs into quite a number of obstacles.
Judith.
Yes. So let's see. Whoops. I don't know how I got to that slide. This is very nice and bragging. Boston's home to many firsts, but that's to show that there's a tradition of innovation in the city. Thank you. I don't know how to move down the slides, though. Oh, here, thumbnails. Okay. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Boston than you probably need to know, but it's because I want those people from other cities to think about the commonalities or the differences in their city. So Boston is a very resource-rich city, as you can see, but it's interesting when we think about it being a resource-rich city, as many cities are. Many cities have strong financial institutions. They have, actually the larger cities have strong economies, even despite this downturn in the economy. But a lot of things are happening in these cities, and part of what we see in Boston, which wants to continue to be a gateway city, wants to continue to be a welcoming city and a place where the poor can live. It is not a city that has eliminated poor people's housing. It's not a city that does big sweeps of the homeless, although we try to house all the homeless. But it's not a place that it has tried to make it impossible for the poor to live. So it's becoming increasingly, because of that, a city of increasing disparities of income. It's a place where immigrants continue to come, but about the same percentage of immigrants come to Boston with less than a high school degree as come with a college degree or more. So we have a lot of immigrants that come for the higher education and they stay here. They're part of our new economy. They're entrepreneurs. They have a lot of businesses. But almost the same percentage, 27% to 33%, come with less than a high school degree. Boston is now a majority minority city, but it's only 50.5% people of color. So it's at the cusp of becoming a majority minority city. The foreign-born population accounts for almost a third of the city's total population. The population of Boston is growing, and it's been growing over the past several years, and we believe that it will continue to grow. It's slightly, as you can see, it's only the 22nd largest city in the country, but in terms of media markets and other things and concentration of certain kinds of resources, we compete with even larger ones. However, there are a lot of poor people in the city. As you can see, 20% of, you can't quite see that here, but 20% of the people, households in the city are under the poverty level. And the majority of kids that go to our public schools come from poor households. As you can see, 76% of kids are eligible for free or reduced lunches. 39% of kids in our public schools do not have English as their first language, and it's only slightly smaller percentage than that who actually need English learning. The City of Boston's anti-poverty efforts have been based on certain kinds of principles, and we try to have a range of programs that address all aspects of poverty. Jobs, economic development, asset building. We have a very, very strong asset building through EITC and other kinds of initiatives. And we're very aggressive about trying to get people eligible for and enrolled in public programs. I don't expect you to read the next slide at all. This is one page of something like a 5-page memo we had about all different kinds of programs. The reason I just put this up there is that they've been successful. So, for instance, the foreclosure rate for home buyers who went through our programs, including one called Don't Borrow Trouble, which started before the downturn. It actually started when the boom started. The rate of foreclosures for similar populations in terms of income was a third of the foreclosure rate for the population at large. You can see from this list that it's not all about services. A lot of it is about access to information. And some of it is creating some social networks. We have crime watch programs and neighborhood planning, but there's not very much about creating social networks, and there's not very much except in giving community-based organizations a great say in development, which I think is what cities often do when they're being responsive to to communities. But other than that, we don't really engage communities terrifically, except if there's a grant requirement in the planning, design of programs. The city is sometimes a catalyst for this, but not always. Boston's a city of innovation, not just public innovation, but private innovation. I tried to list only those programs that I thought were national and would be known to everybody, and there are many more of them. But it's a city that has a lot of social entrepreneurs. So then we come to something like FII. When I first met Maurice, I'm on an advisory board for something called Boston Rising. Boston Rising is a new foundation created by a hedge fund billionaire, I assume he is, who decided that he wanted to devote his efforts and time to fighting poverty. And one of the ways that they set about doing it, since they actually in truth knew nothing at all about poverty, was to go look at models across the country. And since I was on the advisory board, they invited me on some of their learning trips. I only got to go to one, and I met Maurice in New York and immediately said, yes. I mean, Maurice and I laugh about the fact that we didn't let each other finish sentences in the beginning, that it was obvious that this was something we wanted to do. Now, that was in part because in my previous work, I had been very active in the Healthy Cities, Healthy Communities movement, and actually started in Boston in the late 80s, early 90s, Healthy Boston, which used a community development model around the Healthy Cities model, which actually has very little to do with health. It could be called robust cities. But the idea in Healthy Cities is to go to an asset model, to assume that the community knows more about itself than we know about it, and to make sure that solutions to problems are designed together. It still, however, is not the same. It does not go to the extent that Maurice's program goes, and it seemed to me that his was the absolute required next step, that it took a lot of the same principles that Healthy Communities is based on, which is that communities do know more about themselves and have great ideas about what they need to do. But it also says that partnerships between citizens and cities, between community-based organizations and large institutions matter because they each bring something to the table. Through Boston Rising and through our connections with other funders in the city, we were instrumental as a group in bringing FII to Boston. We hope that, and the reason I gave you a lot of the demographic information was to show you that Boston is a city made up of a lot of new people who don't necessarily have the kinds of connections or knowledge or access to the levers of power that older populations have. So they may have networks, they may have social networks, they tend to be small, but those social networks don't have access to the levers of power that the older populations used to have. Secondly, Boston geographically is a small city, and so when there is a pathway up, it's often a pathway out. And so what's left behind in the city, as I tried to talk about before with the disparities in income, is that you have a lot of very, very poor people and a lot of very rich people who are not necessarily connected to one another. So we really like this. One of the things that we liked about, one of the things that we're working with FII about in Boston is the following. If you read any material about FII, people get paid for reporting on their activities. They're not getting paid to do the activities. They're being paid to report on the activities. But of necessity, the list of things you put down as those things about which they can report can be access to services and information as well as doing things for themselves. And this is where that whole list of things that Boston has matters, because it's not about getting the service. It's about understanding your ability to obtain things, to do things, to identify your own problems and your own solutions and take advantage of what is out there. And what we have found historically is that the people that perhaps could benefit the most from what is here don't know how to take advantage of it and don't take advantage of it. The other thing, of course, is that, as Maurice points out, the disparities of what is available to wealthier populations and poor is extraordinary. So we incent middle class and upper class people to take certain kinds of economic, certain kinds of actions in their own economic interest and punish poor people for doing those exact same kinds of things in terms of not allowing people to amass savings in order to benefit from programs. It's having the cliff effect of, when people get jobs, they lose benefits that they need to keep the jobs, all kinds of things. And so we're hoping that what we learn from the populations around FII and what they're doing will give us even more material to push changes in state and federal policy. Last thing, I was asked to comment on how cities in general think about innovation. And boy, these are the wrong sides there. So there are a lot of ways that we encourage innovation. One is from our own employees. We try to do that. Boston has something called the New Urban Mechanics. It's based on the fact that when Menino was elected, he was called an urban mechanic, actually detrimentally, but it's been very successful. And we have an office of urban mechanics that tries to identify problems, is open to best practices in industry, that takes suggestions from community-based organizations, from all different kinds of people have great access to the city, and there are lots of ways that ideas for innovation come in, and it's been relatively successful. So we have means to doing that, one of which is to have lots and lots of young people, interns, fellows that circulate through the city through summer programs. This is where we're actually very benefited by having all these institutions of higher education that need a place to teach their students, that need a place for their students to do practica, that need a place for their students to get real experience. And since we have so many of them wanting to do that, we can also be demanding of the institutions in terms of their contribution to monitoring and participating with that. So we get a lot of good ideas that come from external as well as internal. And we've created this internal network of about 20 city people who are the places that everybody goes when they have an idea. And so we're making it more organized. Two comments about what works and what doesn't work. We find that those social innovators, those social entrepreneurs that are successful in getting things started are not always the same ones that are successful at getting things institutionalized and maintained. And a lot of it has to do about their approach to other partners and their approach to the city, and whether or not they define problems, solutions, approaches, or whether or not they're open to including other people in those. And sometimes that's the community, sometimes that's the providers, sometimes that's the government agencies that are responsible for the services. But when it is in total isolation, even if they get something going, even if they get funding, even if they have wonderful projects, and even when they have successes, it's not going to become maintained, it's not going to become institutionalized because it is separate from and was not and is not owned by any other entity. The other thing that we find doesn't work is when people come to us already convinced about what the solution is, as opposed to being open to having it tested and even having the solution shaped by participation from people that have been working in the area. So those work. Thirdly, I think we find that we get greater collaboration with social entrepreneurs when they know how to or are willing to learn how to interact with the community, because often they come in with great assumptions about community, often negative assumptions, but often sometimes ridiculously positive assumptions that don't treat people as though they're real human beings. And so if they're not open to working with the community as well as working with the city, we find that we don't get success. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. For those of you who are listening, feel free to send questions, type your questions in, send them in. Maurice, I'd like to go back with the first question to you, because as you said, when you started, you weren't sure what would work and how to do this. how do you think about gathering data and assessing what works and what doesn't work? As you are, on the one hand, putting all of your energy into innovating and trying to figure out what the challenges are, what the problems are, how do you assess this on an ongoing basis?
Julie, I think that data, I was an engineer, and so data for me was a big thing. I wanted to know whether we were succeeding and whether it was cost effective, and so that's something that I think we were trying to monitor from the beginning. I had developed a database system when I was with my nonprofit back in the 90s, and we've been testing it out to be able to try to see if we could gather what was going on with different families. It ended up that we could understand what was going on in a family if we gathered information like in about 6 different categories. Income assets was one, education and skills another, their housing and urban environment another, et cetera, et cetera. So there were 6 areas, including the issue of their social networks. And so we would collect data to really try to understand what was going on in a family's life, and that what we assumed out of my engineering is kind of chaos theory, that at a very low level, family level or individual level, it would look like chaos. It would just be a huge diversity of things, and you couldn't make sense at it if you looked at it at a micro level. But like chaos theory says, is that once you start pulling back and you have enough numbers happening, there's patterns that emerge. And so for us, while we get a lot of granular type of data, that what we see when we start looking at the entire groups and entire cities, even though we don't have a lot of families, we have a lot of individuals, that we start seeing different patterns. And those patterns are really the things that could lead family policy or policies that would accentuate something that happens or doesn't happen, what services are needed and not needed. And so that's what we needed to do, is really enroll enough families to see the patterns that would emerge. The thing that happened is that on our end, we wanted the data to understand families and understand what they really wanted and what really helped them along the line. We gather a lot of stories of how come they're making progress and what helped and didn't help. The other thing that happened was that all of the data is given back to the families. So when they go online to report their income changes for the month or whatever, that there's a set of graphs that they see is, okay, over the last 6 months, here's what's happened in my life, and here's the trend. It's going up, it's going down, et cetera, et cetera. And then we give them information of how the entire group and the other groups are doing. So they say, oh, well, that other group is doing better, and they're buying homes, and how they do it, et cetera, et cetera. And that feedback of data, it's kind of like you're running your own business, you're running your own family. That feedback, because you're inputting your data and then seeing what's happening with your life and other people's lives, is really what people have said, it keeps them focused. So the data piece for us has been huge. It both has been one of the major change elements for the families, and it's actually been one of the elements that really helps us to identify what kind of policies and programs help and don't help the families.
Before I go on to my next question, I think, Maurice, it might be useful to take a couple minutes to explain the difference between the family, your initiative, FII, and conditional cash transfers, which are suddenly capturing the imagination of a lot of people in this country. And as I understand it, conditional cash transfers actually give money to people to behave in certain ways. And it sounds like what you're doing is the money they get is to cover the time they take to report, but you're giving them data and other ways of assessing what they're doing, but letting them be quite open about what they choose. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think for us, the big thing was to, again, understand how families, it was sort of like my mother. She did it her own way, and all we wanted was the result. So we were much more interested in the outcome. And we didn't know what outcomes, and what would work for one family or another. Like I said, we were looking for patterns, but in terms of micro level, we knew it was going to be all over the place. So we intentionally made the awards more like $25 to $30 to say, because if it was $5, we knew that they wouldn't pay attention to it and may not report that their kid's grade went up. But if it was $100 or $200, they may just focus on their kids' grades going up as opposed to trying to take care of their housing. We really ended up at the $25, $30 level because it was enough to capture their attention, and they knew that if they had enough things happening, we knew enough about families, not in my life, that we knew that an accumulation of different actions are happening in a month's period. and they could earn, and it was capped. All these issues were capped. They could only earn a certain amount, and we actually capped the different areas so that they had to basically sit there and explain to us what happened in their entire life, from any networking they were doing to any asset building they were doing. So in that sense, it was really difficult. It was really focused on both learning from the families and then making sure that they were in control of the process. It was kind of touchy to not let the dollars be the incentive pieces, but really be essentially pay them for their time. And what we do is we really try to pay them for their time, certainly at a lower rate than what we pay, that what I have to pay for consultants. So it's much cheaper to have them report and just audit their information than to send somebody out that's a professional to try to gather all this information. So I think that's one of the main things. The other piece, though, for us that was added that is really different than the CCI type of programs is that we really are counting on social networks to be the support system. And our sense was that when there is a social network that is your support system as opposed to a case manager and whatever, that the changes that happen in that social network, the expectation now for the refugees that they could buy homes, it starts permeating different, throughout an entire community. And then you could get sustainability because, first of all, it was an action that was taken by the families themselves, not driven by an outsider like FII, but they came up with that solution. They took ownership of it, and now the expectations start changing. So the social network piece was really our way of both addressing the fact that people can't do it by themselves. They do need help. They certainly could, for middle and upper income, they'll buy a financial planner when they need it, but they won't be told that they have to go through financial training to buy a house. So for us, it was like services are really needed, but it needs to be under the control of the family and whatever their goals are. And that once that starts happening, those role models then can permeate the social network. So for us, probably the key thing is let people take initiative. There will be somebody, even if you're very low income and in poverty, you can take an initiative. We do encourage that. We recognize it, and the outside validation is too. But the social network is how it spreads and can sustain and really impact at a much higher level.
Do you find that there are some families, I'm responding to questions that are coming in, some families that have so few resources, they lack, you provide them with a computer, but if they've never seen a computer, do you help them, do you teach them how to use a computer? Are there some families that don't have enough resources to be able to participate?
What was interesting with the computer was that I came out of social services, and when we were first saying we're giving everybody a computer, we set up a technology committee, and we were intending to train everybody and to show them how to report and whatever. To be honest with you, with our staff, we screwed it up. And with that first set of families, they came to pick up their computers. Our trainer was terrible. He didn't speak enough languages. And the families figured out how to take their computers home on their own, where, again, we weren't prepared, to help them. But within a week or two, these families are all getting online and figuring out how to do it. So I'm asking, okay, so given that our technology committee, kind of failed, how is it that these families are doing it? And sure enough, it's like within these networks, there was some 17-year-old that started showing everybody how to do it and whatever. And I think we underestimate how resourceful people are and that there are networks there. And if we step in too soon, we'll never find out what those networks really are. And that's a dilemma that we have with a lot of programs, because I was funded as a program to be proactive. And so therefore, in some ways, assuming that people needed me and needed my technology and training really kept me funded. And it really runs counter to just let the families figure it out. We're sort of, FII and turning to us is sort of last resort, because what we basically do is push them. Go find somebody. All of you know somebody. When I showed you the bubble of the families that are enrolled in FII and they come in with friends, the spread of people that people know, when you talk about single moms, how many single moms? Well, all the single moms generally have, a boyfriend or friends, and they have cousins, and they have grandmothers and whatever, and that we actually push them to reform and strengthen those ties, turn to one another. Somebody had trouble with a lawyer that required a lawyer that might be happy with their lawyer. Ask there first before you come to go to get legal aid through a nonprofit. So a lot of what we do is push the social network piece, and what we've learned is that we assume too quickly that people are isolated, and that if instead we push them to reconnect, they will do it and they want to do it because those can be longer-lasting relationships than with our case managers.
And a piece of that, would you say, not, as you said earlier, giving them the answers, but encouraging them to go out and find the answers?
Yeah, and actually what we found is that people, there are kind of what used to be we used to call them the Aunt Bettys that would kind of sit on the doorstep and watch all the kids kind of coming home and tell their mom if they got in trouble or they'd interfere, or at the beauty salon, they'd all be talking to the beauty salon and say, oh, you know, I did this and this worked for me, and they'd share information and whatever. Those people are still around, and we saw them emerging, and so after we saw these kind of informal leaders, they all have jobs and whatever, they're not professionals or whatever, that what we did is we formed a fellowship program. And in that, what we're able to do is take these kind of emergent leaders, not the nonprofit leaders or whatever, but the ones that are really trusted at a very, very personal level, and be able to, we actually put them in a program where they do get other training so they can get access to some of the networks we're involved with. They can take more leadership and really just give them the opportunities to play a bigger role. So there is that aspect that, again, we had underestimated in our communities.
One of the real novelties and at the same time the very tough parts of the FII is the fact that you've really flipped around this idea of who's driving the change. And I think many professions are trying to move into a situation where the families that they work with are more of the driver of the change, but having difficulty. Child welfare, for example, is in the midst of something like this. So Judith and Maurice, how do you find, what is the resistance to flipping this around, and how do you address that? You're going to have to face it in Boston, Judith.
Yeah, and it's going to be an interesting test and question, and Maurice and I have talked about this a little bit. Boston is, when I said it was a resource-rich city, it also has tons and tons of social services. Massachusetts and Boston have prided themselves on providing any service that anybody needs. There are the same number of neighborhood health centers in the city as there are in the city of Chicago, a city of 5 times the size. So part of the pushback comes from an awful lot of well-intentioned, decent people who are passionate about helping the poor, but don't really implicitly believe that the poor can help themselves. And that's going to be a big problem. 2 is that in part because of the disbelief and disregard for both the poor and for government, that nobody wants to make investments that don't immediately show results, and that can't be monitored very, very closely. It's very interesting to me that anytime you want to have any kind of program that provides a benefit, almost one of the first questions that comes up is how are you going to protect against fraud and abuse, as though that's the first thing that will happen. So it's both, we have a service mentality, there is this kind of noblesse oblige about the poor. There are a lot of people, and not for bad reasons, but who make their livings and their intellectual capital and their real sense of fulfillment from providing services. And then there is this sort of anti-government, anti-poor people model. So it's going to be interesting. The other thing, though, is, and this is more insidious, is that these generations of services that have been provided have literally, they have actually created some dependencies, but they've also created this notion, often among the recipients themselves, that they cannot and sometimes should not be responsible for their own behavior. But often it's that they cannot because we've created a service kind of mentality.
So you're really getting both groups you're trying to get both groups to flip their thinking around.
Yes.
Along this line, one of the questions that's come through, Maurice, is how do you define improvement? As I understand it, you let the families define improvement for themselves. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think for us, for my mother, certainly at different stages in her life, I'm sorry, I keep going back to my family, but it obviously influenced my work a lot. For my mother, she defined success that at different points in her life in different ways, and certainly ultimately as she was kind of coming to the end of her life, that it was defined in terms of my succeeding and being able to do something bigger. By this time, she knew kind of her life was pretty limited, and my sister's life was pretty limited. different people will kind of define it different ways. In Hawaii, it was really fascinating. With the Hawaiians, they were very non-materialistic, and so for them it was really the issue of how strong their social network was, and that strengthening was what was really key. In Oakland, what we found is most of the communities focused on businesses and home ownership, and in San Francisco, where it's really hard to buy homes, we see a really huge concentration on kids doing better in school. 70% of the kids' grades have gone up, within 2 years, and so it's amazing how much energy has been put by the families in San Francisco. So, and if you go to a micro level, again, it's kind of all over the place, but these are the patterns. For us, then, the definition is that people define their own success, that it is that they are taking control of their life, and control means that they can meet their basic needs, food, shelter, and whatever, which in this country often takes either income or friends that are willing to carry that. And we know, rich kids that are perpetual students at UC Berkeley that have almost no income, but their dad supports them, so the social network is important. So they need to meet their social, their kind of, by choice, their basic needs, and then be able to make choices for their future, whether it's that student at UC Berkeley or whether it's a family that decides I want a home or not want a home. So control and choice is the definition FII uses. However, funders and policy people don't look at that. For them, what they look is the fact that there is correlating evidence that income goes up, debt goes down, credit ratings go up. And so there is a correlation. When people take more control of their life, we get correlating indicators. And because we track so much data, we can show these different indicators. And surely enough, what people become interested from policy side is that, well, incomes are going up and debt is going down and people are buying assets, et cetera. For us, again, we see it happen at very different levels with different communities, some needing more assets on the economic side, others really needing more social assets. And so that's where we backed out in terms of our definition is different than the community's definition, which is very particular to their culture, or the policy and funder type of definition for success. And we have to deal with all three. Our system of just really encouraging people to do whatever they feel they're best at then still leads to success in all these fields.
We have several questions lined up, and I was wondering if both panelists could stay online another 10 minutes. Would that be possible?
Sure.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so the two questions I'd like to focus on. The first, Maurice, several people have asked what kind of data you collect, and I was wondering whether you have any of this data available on your website.
Actually, it's in the slideshow. Can I bring that back up, Tim?
You may, because there's another question about the slideshow.
Oh, okay. So if I'm going to it right now, and I'm not sure if people can see it, but in this slide, if you can see it, what happens is I did have a database system that was developed when I was with my nonprofit. That system has obviously, evolved over time, and I think it's really a great system. Every family is given a computer. They have to report online every month. We do a baseline so that we can figure out what's going on at the very beginning and how change happens, the types of trends. In the monthly reporting that the families have to go into, they'll see a list of questions that are asked. We also have survey questions, so we can ask them questions about what kind of services are working, what's not working, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have just added what is kind of the equivalent of we have to come up with a new name for it, but it's kind of like a poor people's Yelp. So basically, it's a lot of our families do access social services, government services. They've told us a lot of stories about them, but we've had no way of accumulating that. And I know Judith has wanted the information, and she says we have a lot of nonprofits. We don't know what works and doesn't work from the vantage point of the consumer. And that's one of the things that's missing in all our systems is that we rarely hear from the consumer. You hear what the nonprofit tells you about the consumer, but not directly from the consumer. And technology nowadays really allows for that really direct access to information. So there's this Poor People's Yelp that's being added right now, and the families in San Francisco are testing it. So when they go to a program, they now will rate it with 5 stars. 1 is terrible, and then do comments as to what works and doesn't work. That's how we use data online. We also meet with them monthly because we want to get the stories behind the data. Data can be very misleading, and so we have liaisons that really collect those stories and give us color. And then we have to use common sense as to whether this data makes sense or doesn't make sense. the range of data, as I mentioned, is around different categories, income and assets being one, et cetera, and that shows on this slide. What happens is that we actually can get very granular. So if we just look at income within this whole thing, families report to us how much is income based on food stamps, et cetera, how much is formal employment, and then how much is informal employment. Because what I think everybody knows, working with very low-income families, if you look at how much they're getting from welfare or whatever and how much they report, and then you look at their expenses, it doesn't match. And what we work with is families to build trust. So they can tell us exactly how it is they survived. Is it somebody else that's paying for those costs, or do they have under-the-table income coming in because they're selling papusas or tamales on the side and whatever? And that's what we're finding is these families are very entrepreneurial, which doesn't show up on most people's radar screens. And in Oakland, there's a $400 million underground economy, not drugs, not prostitution. These are people that are just entrepreneurs but have not surfaced their businesses. Now we're looking at loan programs for them, how you can change the rules so they will. So that's the kind of level of information that we can get from the families. The reason they do this is not only does it help them to understand what's going on in their lives and that I've given up food stamps and I feel good about that, but they realize that people like Judith are looking at this, that people in really high positions, now there's some people in the White House that are interested, people want to know what life is like from their perspective. And now it's families teaching us. And so data actually has become a really important element for this whole thing. Now, I'm not sure if I answered your question specifically, though, but the background.
I think that was a quite thorough answer. And then the final question, someone pointed out you skipped over your slide on policy, but I'd like to ask both you and Judith to talk about what are the policy implications of FII, particularly given the current economy with so many people out of work and people having lost their unemployment insurance benefits. I mean, how can you go to scale with something like this, or should you?
Judith?
And how should it influence the way other people provide services?
The more data that Maurice gathers, not just in Boston but nationally, because a lot of the policies that we think undermine poor people or undermine their ability to escape from poverty in any kind of permanent way is national policy. And so the more data that he gathers about people's ability when not constrained and when supported in ways, as I said before, that where we do support the middle class with all kinds of economic incentives, but for the poor we actually punish them. So the more that we can document this, the more that we can say that there are policies often meant to help that inhibit growth. That's one kind of policy that we need to look at. The second one, however, is to remove some of the constraints about what people are allowed to do to help themselves. And there it's often influencing local policy and the work of not-for-profits and community-based organizations. It's not just about government. An awful lot of policy and an awful lot of services in our society are provided by community-based organizations and not-for-profits. They may be funded by government in the main, but they are provided by those organizations that tend to dismiss or denigrate the ability of people to help themselves. So I think those policies will be useful. The cliff issues are paramount. You know, you earn a little bit of money and you lose your child care voucher and you lose your food stamps, and in the past you lost your Medicaid. So those things I think are extraordinarily important. We also want it because Boston is very, very data-driven. We gather tons of data. The city gathers data. We work with all kinds of private organizations. We have a Boston Indicators project that measures everything. But we often don't have qualitative information that tells us how groups are doing, and what we would like to do is relate the qualitative to the quantitative. So we are bringing together, for instance, all of the out-of-school and after-school programs data with the school program. So we can say that the kids that go to this ballet class are doing better in school than the kids that go to that ballet class, or, you know, whatever it's going to be. Now, if we can also have a kind of qualitative information that will help us figure out where we do our funding. So if funding is your ultimate policy, then that's a big thing about where we want to drive funding, both by ourselves and by philanthropy. So it goes to those organizations that are actually providing value.
And Julie, I'll add a little bit from the family perspective. You know, the recession hit our families really hard. And so then what we were doing is monitoring, okay, how are they surviving? And what was fascinating is in 2009 was really the worst year, and people were losing jobs and whatever. Income for at least the Ripple families, which were the ones that were brought in by the initial families, the core families, went down about 8% during 2009. But by the beginning of this year, it recovered back to where they were. And as we looked at what people did in order to survive, we saw an amazing amount of entrepreneurship and mutuality. People were helping one another. So we'd ask them, so how are you staying? And you'd find out that somebody was helping you, or you were starting to sell more tamales, or actually that was a big one, that we saw all of a sudden income jumped on the informal income to $1,500 from selling tamales. And there were all these fascinating things that people were doing and learning from one another, which doesn't normally show up on the radar screen. But again, it points to how resourceful and how hard people really work to keep their families. But again, with no resources, I can tell you that these families and our initiative needs the economic recovery. We see that entrepreneurship in many ways, that's kind of what's happened historically, is these communities have often had to just have these little microeconomies of their own because the macroeconomy was all screwed up. So that's what we see happening right now. However, as the macroeconomy starts recovering, what we see is these families need connections to bigger opportunities, and I think that's where working with Judith and the city and the different programs and whatever, that's where it'll come into play.
I'd like to thank both of you. This has been a really informative and probing discussion, and I'd like to thank the audience for sending in questions.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. This is Tim. I just wanted to thank you all and thank you for attending, and the panelists, and to call your attention to, if I could, the other, the 3 upcoming webinars in our Power of Social Innovation series. So I'll just leave this on the screen as everybody departs. Thanks again.
So, Tim, do we stay on the line?
Nope, we're all set. Thank you, Maurice. Thank you, Judith.
This was fun. Thanks.
Okay, so we don't have to stay on the line?
You're all set. You can go back to work.
Okay, great. Thank you a lot. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Great.
We'll be in touch.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.